Dae-sung froze. Behind him, his bodyguards moved with lethal precision, hands reaching inside jackets as they scanned the crowd, but with a single, sharp tilt of his head, they became statues. This was a man who lived in the shadows of high-rises, a man people crossed the street to avoid, yet here was a child treating him like a sanctuary. Dae-sung's eyes shifted from the girl to the man emerging from the crowd. Oh, Manchul, panting, his hand outstretched to grab her. Manchul stopped dead, the color draining from his face as he realized whose path he had just crossed. Dae-sung looked down, noticing the girl's red dress was torn and her knees were scraped from the chase. He stepped forward, putting his tall, imposing frame between the girl and the predator. You chose the wrong street, Dae-sung said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. And you definitely chose the wrong girl. At that moment, everyone on Jade Sparrow Street understood. Manchul hadn't just made a mistake. He had invited a nightmare. What the boss did next would be whispered about in every corner of the city for years to come. Manchul's boots skidded against the asphalt as he tried to dig them in, a desperate attempt to arrest his forward momentum. The air on Jade Sparrow Street had thickened, turning heavy and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. Just seconds ago, he had been the hunter, his fingers itching to wrap around the collar of that red dress. Now, as he looked past the small, trembling girl and into the eyes of Dae-sung, he realized he had accidentally stepped into the mouth of a volcano. Manchul's eyes darted frantically to the left, then the right. He looked for an opening, a gap in the crowd, a side alley, anything that offered a path away from a man in the charcoal suit. But the world had closed in. At the northern end of the block, two black SUVs had drifted into a diagonal slant, effectively turning the street into a dead end. From the southern end, four men in identical dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the storefronts. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They simply walked with a synchronized, rhythmic pace of a predatory pack, their hands folded neatly in front of them, eyes fixed on Manchul with a terrifying lack of emotion. The shoppers and street vendors who had been bustling moments ago now pressed themselves against the brick walls of the shops, sensing the atmospheric shift. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft, ragged hitches of Kim Hae-in's breath as she buried her face in the expensive fabric of Dae-sung's trousers. Dae-sung, I didn't know. Manchul stammered, his voice cracking, the bravado he had used to chase a child evaporating into thin air. He took a staggering step backward, his hands raised in pathetic gesture of peace. It's not what it looks like. The girl, she's part of a debt. Business, Dae-sung. Just business. Dae-sung didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon, and he didn't signal his men to close the distance. He simply stood there, a mountain of calm in the middle of Manchul's crumbling world. The aggression radiating from the boss wasn't loud. It was a focused, redirected heat. Every muscle in his jaw was set like granite. Manchul glanced behind him again. The bodyguard had stopped 10 paces away, forming a human wall that mirrored the SUVs at the other end. There was no back door. There was no escape. He was trapped on a stage of his own making, with the entire street acting as a jury. He looked at the red dress, then at the boss's frozen expression, and finally understood the gravity of his mistake. In Dae-sung's world, you could steal money and you could seize territory, but the moment you put your hands on a child to settle a score, you ceased to be a businessman. You became a target. Dae-sung did not look at the man begging for his life. His focus remained entirely on the small, trembling figure anchored to his side. With a grace that seemed at odds with his lethal reputation, the boss slowly lowered himself to one knee. The movement was deliberate, causing the pristine crease of his trousers to press against the gritty pavement of Jade Sparrow Street. Hae-in, he said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic frequency that acted like a tether for the girl's spiraling panic. Look at me. As she lifted her Tay-streaked face, the afternoon sun caught the vivid red of her dress, a color that now seemed to scream of a violation of the street sanctuary. Dae-sung reached out, his large, callous hand gently taking her small wrist. He turned it over, and the air around him seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Circling her delicate skin were dark, angry welts, the unmistakable friction burns of a coarse nylon rope. His thumb brushed just beside the injury, never touching the raw skin, yet his touch was steady. He noticed more then, the way her shoulder flinched when he moved, the faint, purplish shadow beginning to bloom along her jawline where a heavy hand had clearly tried to silence her. These weren't the marks of a business dispute. They were the signatures of a coward who used pain to control those who couldn't fight back. Dae-sung's quiet fury didn't manifest as a shout or a sudden movement. Instead, it was a tightening of the skin around his eyes, a microscopic shift in his posture that made him seem twice as large. He had spent a lifetime navigating the cruelties of the underworld, but he operated on a foundation of discipline. To him, power was a scalpel's edge. Manchul was using it like a blunt, rusted hammer. The boss stood up slowly, the transition from gentle protector back to apex predator so seamless it left the onlookers breathless. He didn't just see a rival in front of him anymore. He saw a stain on the honor of the district he had spent a decade refining. "You used a rope on a child, Manchul?" Dae-sung asked. The question wasn't an inquiry. It was a verbal execution. The words hung in the still air, heavy with the weight of a death warrant. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded silk handkerchief, handing it to the girl without breaking eye contact with his enemy. "Hold this to your wrist, little one," he murmured. "The stinging is almost over. For you, at least." Manchul tried to speak, but the words died in a throat constricted by primal fear. He watched as Dae-sung adjusted his cuffs, the silent, suited guards closing the circle until the sunlight barely reached the center of the street. The inspection was over. The verdict was written in the cold, dark depths of Han Dae-sung's eyes. The heavy silence of Jade Sparrow Street was no longer a side effect of fear. It had become a courtroom. Han Dae-sung didn't signal his men to drag Manchul into the shadows of a nearby warehouse or secluded basement. Instead, he stood his ground in the center of the thoroughfare, bathed in the judgmental glow of the afternoon sun. By refusing to hide this confrontation, Dae-sung was making the street a witness to a transformation of power. "Look around you, Manchul," Dae-sung commanded, his voice carrying with a resonant authority that reached every open window and hushed bystanders. "You thought the people of this street were invisible. You thought they were sheep to be sheared while you hunted a child in broad daylight." Manchul's knees buckled, his eyes darting toward the crowd of residents who were now slowly stepping forward from the storefronts. The grocery store owner, the florist, the young couples, they were no longer retreating. Under the umbrella of Dae-sung's protection, their fear was curdling into a collective, silent rage. I was just recovering what was mine," Manchul whimpered, his voice thin and pathetic against the backdrop of the boss's composure. "Her father owes." "I don't care what is owed," Dae-sung interrupted, the word sharp as a guillotine. He took a step toward the older man, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement. "In my city, debt is settled between men. Only a coward reaches for a girl in a red dress because he is too weak to face a father. Tell them, Manchul, tell everyone on this street why you thought you were entitled to put rope on a 6-year-old's wrists." Manchul opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The public trial was stripping him of more than just his dignity. It was erasing the myth of his power. By forcing him to answer in the light of day, Dae-sung was showing the neighborhood that the monster they feared was nothing more than a small, desperate man caught in a spotlight he couldn't survive. Dae-sung turned his head slightly, acknowledging the crowd for the first time. "This man claims to be a leader in our world, but today he is just a trespasser." He looked back at Manchul, his eyes darkening. "Justice in the dark is for those who are shamed. I want the sun to see what happens when someone breaks the unwritten law of Jade Sparrow Street." The boss's silent guards tightened the circle, their presence a physical barrier between the old ways and the new order. Manchul collapsed to his hands and knees, the realization hitting him that there would be no quiet execution. This was a public dismantling, one that would leave him with nowhere to hide and no one left to fear him. The trial had begun, and the verdict was already written in the disgusted glaze of the people he had once tried to terrorize. The shift in the atmosphere was as subtle as a changing tide, yet just as unstoppable. While Han Dae-sung held the center of the street with a chilling, magnetic focus, his silent army began to move. They did not draw weapons. They did not need to. Their efficiency was a byproduct of years of absolute discipline, a sharp contrast to the chaotic desperation of old Manchul's crew. Dae-sung's lead enforcer, a man whose shadow seemed to swallow the light, gave a nearly imperceptible nod. In an instant, the guards transitioned from statues to shadows. They drifted toward the fringes of the crowd and the dark mouths of the surrounding alleys where Manchul's hidden associates had been lurking, waiting for a signal that would now never come. The clean-up was methodical, executed with the terrifying grace of a predator that had already won. Behind the rows of parked cars and beneath the colorful awnings of the Jade Sparrow street cafes, brief, muffled scuffles broke the silence. A lookout positioned in a recessed doorway was neutralized with a single, swift motion before he could even reach for his phone. Another associate, trying to blend into the terrified crowd, felt a gloved hand on his shoulder, a grip like an iron vice that steered him out of sight without a word being exchanged. Manchul's eyes widened as he realized his backup was being erased in real time. He looked toward the rooftop of a nearby bakery, hoping to see the glint of a rifle or the familiar face of his brother, but there was only the empty, blue sky and the soft fluttering of pigeons. His support network, built on fear and flimsy loyalties, was collapsing under the weight of Dae-sung's superior architecture. This wasn't a street brawl, it was a surgical removal. The bodyguards operated with a terrifying silence, ensuring that the peaceful residents of the street were shielded from the actual violence. To the onlookers, it looked like a choreographed dance, men in suits appearing and disappearing, leaving the area cleaner and quieter than they found it. By the time the lead enforcer returned to stand behind Dae-sung, the perimeter was absolute. Manchul was now truly alone, stripped of his shadows, standing in a vacuum created by the boss's will. The silent army had cleared the stage, leaving only the predator and the coward to face the final act. The perimeter was now a fortress of silence, and the street had become a stage where every small movement felt like a tectonic shift. Han Dae-sung turned his back on the kneeling, broken figure of Manchul, a gesture of supreme dismissal that spoke louder than any threat. His focus returned to Kim Han, who stood small and shivering in the center of the asphalt, her red dress dusty and her spirit fraying at the edges. Dae-sung reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal-gray jacket. With a flick at his wrist, he produced a handkerchief of heavy, cream-colored silk, hand-rolled and embroidered with a subtle silver crest. To the businessmen and onlookers watching from behind their shop windows, that handkerchief was a symbol of his untouchable status, a piece of fabric worth more than the weekly rent of most apartments on the street. He knelt again, ignoring the way the rough pavement bit into his suit. "Hold still, Hae-in," he murmured, his voice losing the jagged edge of the predator and softening into something almost paternal. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man whose hands had shaped the city's underworld, he began to dab at the scrapes on her knees. The silk soaked up the small beads of blood and the grit of the street. He moved with meticulous care, as if he were handling the most fragile porcelain in the world. The girl's sobbing slowed, replaced by wide-eyed wonder as she looked at the man the adults called a monster. The witnesses on Jade Sparrow Street stood frozen. They had seen Han Dae-sung command empires. They had seen him move through the city like a ghost of vengeance. But they had never seen him humanized. The sight of the most dangerous man in the country using his finest silk to tend to a child's scraped knee was a shock that rippled through the crowd like an electric current. It was a declaration that his power was not just for destruction, but for the fierce protection of the small and the broken. When he finished, he didn't take the silk back. He gently wrapped it around her wrist, covering the angry rope burns Manchul had inflicted. He tucked the ends in securely, creating a soft, shimmering bandage that smelled of expensive cologne and safety. "Keep it," he said, looking her in the eyes. "It's yours now. A reminder that on this street, no one will ever hurt you again." He stood up then, his face hardening back into a mask of granite as he turned his gaze toward the sky, then back to the cowering man behind him. The gesture was complete. He had given the girl more than a piece of silk. He had given her his word. And as the residents of Jade Sparrow Street watched the girl clutch that cream-colored cloth to her chest, they realized that the monster they feared had just become the only man they would ever truly trust. Would you like me to move on to the next chapter, where the tension spikes as Manchul makes a desperate, final gamble? Old Manchul was a man who had built a life on the exploitation of the weak, and like all predators backed into a corner, he mistook Han Dae-sung's momentary focus on the child for a lapse in vigilance. As the boss stood up, smoothing the front of his charcoal jacket, Manchul's hand went into a frantic, blurred motion. He reached for the small of his back, his fingers closing around the cold, serrated handle of a hidden ceramic blade, a weapon designed to pass through metal detectors and end lives in silence. He didn't aim for the bodyguards. He didn't even aim for Dae-sung. In a final, sickening act of cowardice, Manchul lunged toward the girl, hoping to regain his leverage. But Han Dae-sung was not a man who suffered from lapses. Before Manchul's arm could even fully extend, Dae-sung moved. It wasn't a frantic scramble. It was an explosion of calculated, violent grace. He closed the distance in a single stride, his movement so fast it seemed to skip the frames in between. His left hand shot out like a strike of lightning, his palm slamming into Manchul's forearm with a sickening crack that echoed off the brick walls of Jade Sparrow Street. The blade clattered to the asphalt, useless. Without a second's hesitation, Dae-sung pivoted his weight. He caught Manchul by the throat with his right hand, the strength in his fingers enough to lift the older man nearly off his feet. The boss's face remained a mask of terrifying composure, his eyes never widening, his breath never quickening. He drove his knee into Manchul's solar plexus with a dull thud that sucked the air out of the street, followed by a swift, open palm strike to the jaw that sent Manchul spinning into the pavement. The enemy lay in a heap, his face pressed against the very grit he had forced the girl to run through. Dae-sung didn't draw a gun. He didn't need one. He simply stood over the fallen man, his shadow stretching long and dark across the asphalt. He adjusted his silk tie, his breathing as calm as if he had just finished a casual stroll. The bodyguards didn't move an inch. They knew their boss. The witnesses on the street, however, were paralyzed. They had seen violence before, but never anything this surgical, this absolute. It wasn't just a fight. It was a demonstration of the sheer physical gap between a desperate thug and a true master of the city. Dae-sung looked down at the whimpering man at his feet, his voice returning to that low, deadly vibration. "You had the chance to walk away a prisoner," Dae-sung murmured, the coldness in his tone chilling the afternoon air. "Now, you will leave as a lesson." He didn't look back at the girl, but his hand reached out instinctively, ensuring she stayed behind the wall of his protective presence. The gamble had failed, and the price of the entry was about to be paid in full. The air on Jade Sparrow Street, once paralyzed by the cold efficiency of Han Dae-sung's combat, began to hum with a new, collective energy. The residents had watched the boss kneel to tend a child. They had watched him dismantle a predator with surgical precision. For years, they had lived under the shadow of men like Manchul, swallowing their grievances like bitter pills. But as Dae-sung stood over the broken man, his composure unshakable, the barrier of their silence finally shattered. It started with the elderly florist from the corner shop. She stepped out from behind her display of chrysanthemums, her hands no longer shaking. She didn't look at the boss with fear, but with a grim, newfound respect. She pointed a gnarled finger toward a nondescript laundry van parked 3 blocks down, its engine idling in a way that had always seemed suspicious. "Here's 2 more in the back of that van," she said, her voice thin but clear. "They've been crying since noon." Her courage acted as a catalyst. Like a dam bursting, the neighborhood's collective memory poured out. The grocery store owner, who had previously looked at the ground whenever Manchul passed, stepped forward next. The basement of the old dry cleaners, he shouted, his voice gaining strength. "He keeps the others there, the ones whose fathers couldn't pay his protection tax. He told us if we spoke, he'd burn our shops with us inside." Dae-sung listened, his expression unreadable, though his eyes darkened with every new revelation. He didn't interrupt. He allowed the people of Jade Sparrow Street to reclaim their voices, turning the public trial into a public reckoning. One by one, mothers, shopkeepers, and even the young delivery drivers began to speak, pointing out the hidden corners and boarded-up rooms where Manchul had stashed the human collateral of his desperate business. It was the neighborhood's choice. They were no longer just witnesses. They were the architects of Manchul's total downfall. They were handing Dae-sung the keys to the enemy's entire operation, not because they loved the Mafia, but because they trusted the man who had knelt in the dirt for Kim Hae-in. Dae-sung looked at his lead enforcer and gave a short, sharp nod toward the dry cleaners and the idling van. "Secure them all," he commanded. "Bring everyone home." As his men moved to execute the orders, the residents of the street stood taller. The fear that had defined Jade Sparrow Street for months was being replaced by a fierce, protective pride. They looked at the girl in the red dress, now standing safely behind the boss, and then at the broken man on the ground. The choice had been made. The street no longer belonged to the shadows. It belonged to the people, and to the man who was willing to bleed for their children. The sun had begun to dip behind the high-rises of the city, casting long, skeletal shadows across Jade Sparrow Street, but the light on Han Dae-sung had never been clearer. He looked down at Oh Man-chul, who was trembling on the pavement, his face a mask of blood and dust. The physical beating had been swift, but Dae-sung knew that in their world, pain was temporary. The true execution was the removal of a man's name. Dae-sung reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb sliding across the screen with a casual indifference that chilled the onlookers. He didn't call for a hitman or a cleanup crew. Instead, he opened a live feed connected to the city's underground financial exchange, a network where every major player, from the high-rise boardrooms to the harbor docks, monitored the pulse of power. Man-chul, Dae-sung said, his voice amplified by the silence of the street. You told these people you were a businessman. You told them you had the backing of the northern syndicates. The boss turned the screen toward the broken man. On the display, a series of red lines began to plummet. With a few tap commands, Dae-sung had initiated a total freeze on every account associated with Man-chul's name. He wasn't just taking his money. He was signaling to the entire country that Oh Man-chul was a liability, a man who broke the code and brought the heat of the public eye onto their world. As of this second, Dae-sung continued, his eyes like chips of black ice. You no longer exist. No one will take your calls. No one will honor your debts. Even the men you thought were your friends are currently scrubbing your name from their ledgers. The final blow came not from a fist, but from a simple gesture. Dae-sung looked up at the residents of Jade Sparrow Street and spoke to them, ignoring the man at his feet entirely. This man is not a ghost, he said firmly. He is nothing. If he ever sets foot on this street again, he is not a matter for the police, and he is not a matter for me. He is a trespasser with no protection. Do with him what you will. The realization hit Man-chul harder than any punch. To be stripped of protection in a city like this was a fate worse than death. He was now a man without a shadow, a predator turned into prey. He looked around at the faces of the shopkeepers, the people he had bullied and robbed, and saw that their fear had been replaced by a cold, calculating hunger for justice. Dae-sung turned away, the sound of his footsteps steady and rhythmic against the asphalt. He had delivered the final lesson. Power is not found in a rope or a hidden blade. It is found in the respect of the street, and once that is lost, there is no hole deep enough to hide in. Behind him, the crowd began to close in, a human tide of accountability that Oh Man-chul would never escape. The sirens of the approaching authorities were a distant hum, a signal that the world of official records was finally catching up to the justice that had already been served. But on Jade Sparrow Street, the Real resolution was happening in the center of the asphalt. A frantic couple burst through the line of onlookers, their faces etched with a terror that only a parent can know. When they saw Kim Hae-in, standing small but safe, her wrist wrapped in a shimmering silk bandage, the mother let out a cry that broke the final remnants of the afternoon's tension. Hae-in let go of the boss's jacket and ran, her red dress a blur of motion as she collided with her parents. Han Dae-sung stood back, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the reunion with a face that remained unreadable. He did not seek their gratitude. He did not offer a smile. He simply observed the raw, messy humanity of a family made whole again, a stark contrast to the cold, structured world he inhabited. The father looked up, his eyes meeting Dae-sung's. He began to step forward, perhaps to offer thanks or a handshake, but he stopped when he saw the boss's expression. It wasn't a look of warmth, but one of absolute, terrifying clarity. It was a look of a man who had seen the darkness and decided to own it so that others wouldn't have to. Without a word, the father bowed low, a deep, traditional sign of respect that was quickly mirrored by the shopkeepers and neighbors standing nearby. Dae-sung turned toward his idling motorcade. His lead enforcer held the door open, his eyes scanning the rooftops one last time to ensure the cleanup was complete. Before stepping into the darkened interior of the car, Dae-sung paused. He looked down the length of Jade Sparrow Street, his gaze lingering on the storefronts, the families, and the spot where Man-chul had been dismantled. The message he left behind required no speech. His presence had rewritten the unwritten rules of the district. He was a shadow that patrolled the light, the monster that kept the other monsters at bay. As the door clicked shut and the engine purred to life, the residents felt a strange, new equilibrium. The boss was leaving, but his influence remained, hovering over the street like an invisible shield. As the black sedans glided away into the twilight, the message was etched into the minds of everyone who had watched the girl in the red dress fine sanctuary. Han Dae-sung was more than a name or a title. On these streets, he was a law. And the law had never been more absolute.